The Invisible Architecture of Manipulative Communication, a philosophical reflection on clarity, silence, and psychological boundaries. There is a particular kind of relationship many people experience at least once in their lives. It is not a relationship marked by open hostility. There are no dramatic confrontations, no obvious betrayal, and yet, after every conversation with that person, something strange happens. You leave the interaction feeling tired, not physically tired, but mentally blurred. You replay the conversation in your head. You begin asking yourself questions. Was I too sensitive? Maybe I misunderstood. Perhaps if I had explained myself better, things would have turned out differently. And the most troubling part is this. You begin doubting your own perception. If you have ever held on to those questions long after a conversation ended, then this talk is for you. This lecture is not about accusing anyone. It is not about identifying villains or proving who is right. Philosophy rarely begins with the question, who is right? Instead, philosophy asks something more useful. What pattern keeps repeating? When we shift from blaming individuals to observing structures, a different kind of understanding emerges. Interestingly, an ancient spiritual text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes human suffering in a similar way. It suggests that suffering rarely comes from a single event. Instead, suffering arises when the mind becomes trapped in a repeating structure of perception. In other words, it is not always the event that traps us. It is the pattern of the relationship surrounding that event. Today, we are going to examine one of those patterns, a type of person who does not attack directly, a person who rarely confronts others openly, and yet, wherever they go, misunderstandings multiply. Conflicts appear. People begin arguing with one another. And strangely, this person always seems to stand slightly outside the chaos, not responsible, not involved, just present. I call this personality type the distortion messenger. The danger of this person is not that they are evil. In fact, many of them appear polite, reasonable, even sympathetic. The danger lies in how they operate within relationships. Their communication style gradually clouds the perception of others. Clarity fades. Certainty dissolves, and the emotional burden quietly shifts onto the people around them. That is why the purpose of this lecture is simple. Not accusation, not moral judgment, but recognition. Because once you recognize the structure, you are inside. You gain the ability to step outside of it. Understanding alone is not enough. In the real world, knowledge must translate into practical awareness. So the question becomes, can we recognize this pattern early? Surprisingly, yes. There are several signals that tend to appear repeatedly. For example, a person who rarely communicates directly, but instead relays messages through third parties. A person whose sources are always vague. Someone said, people are feeling. I heard that. Notice how the origin of the statement is always unclear. Another signal is the frequent use of phrases like, that's not what I meant. You misunderstood me. When conflicts arise, this person steps backward. When clarification is suggested, they become uncomfortable. Documentation is avoided. Written communication suddenly feels unnecessary. Meanwhile, they remain curiously close to emotionally charged situations where people are upset, where tensions are rising. And when the conflict finally settles, they often appear strangely displaced, as if their role in the relationship has disappeared. These signs are not meant to accuse anyone. They function more like a map, a way of understanding where you are standing inside a relational structure. But the more important question is not about them. It is about you. Ask yourself honestly, are you currently trapped in the urge to constantly explain yourself? Does the pressure to correct misunderstandings feel stronger than the facts themselves? When you think about that person, do you feel anger first or exhaustion? And after every conversation, Do you leave with the unsettling sense that somehow you became the problem? If even two of these questions resonate with you, there is a strong chance that you are already inside this relational structure. At this point, many people make a critical mistake. They try to solve the problem through better explanation. But explanation is exactly the mechanism that keeps the structure alive. Instead, what you need are clear response principles. Simple ones. Practical ones. Principle 1. Speak only in verifiable facts. Remove speculation. Remove interpretation. Principle 2. Declare boundaries in clear language. For example, I will discuss that issue directly with the person involved. Principle 3. Block indirect communication. There is no need to relay that message. Principle 4. Leave records. Conversations become much clearer when they exist in written form. Principle 5. Never repeat the same explanation twice. These steps are not strategies designed to change the other person. They're minimal conditions for protecting your own clarity. Ancient philosophy understood something modern psychology often forgets. Self-discipline is not always about doing more. Sometimes it is about not reacting. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes spiritual practice in a surprisingly practical way. Practice means recognizing the moment when you could react and choosing not to. Not explaining every accusation, not correcting every misunderstanding, not taking responsibility for the state of someone else's consciousness. When this discipline becomes consistent, something remarkable happens. Your mind becomes lighter because the energy once spent on defending yourself slowly disappears. If I had to summarize this entire discussion in one sentence, it would be this: any relationship that constantly forces you to explain yourself is rarely a healthy one. Healthy relationships do not require endless defense. Clarity does not need constant persuasion. And here lies a paradox of human communication. The more you try to explain yourself inside a distorted structure, the more stable that structure becomes. But the moment you stop explaining, something shifts. The structure begins to lose its power. Finally, there is one last principle worth remembering. Understanding a person's psychology does not obligate you to remain inside their influence. Compassion does not mean tolerating confusion. The wisdom traditions of the world never taught us to maintain every relationship at any cost. They taught something far simpler. Do not allow your awareness to become clouded. And when your clarity increases, some people may become uncomfortable. That discomfort is not your failure. It is simply the sound of confusion losing its influence. Because in the end, there is one final insight worth remembering. Truth is usually quiet. Confusion is what makes the most noise. Why some manipulative personalities rarely change. A psychological and philosophical reflection. In the previous part of this discussion, we arrived at a difficult but important insight. Healthy relationships do not require endless explanation. Clarity does not need constant defense. And when a relationship repeatedly forces you to justify your reality, something deeper than a simple misunderstanding may be happening. At that point, a natural question begins to emerge in many people's minds. If these patterns are so destructive, why do the people who create them almost never change? Why does someone reach middle age or even old age while continuing the same behavior? Many people ask this question with genuine confusion. Why are they still like this? After all those experiences, why haven't they matured? To understand this, we have to move beyond everyday explanations about personality quirks. From the perspective of psychology, the behavior of this type of person is rarely just a habit. It is closer to what psychologists call an identity strategy. In other words, they are not merely choosing these behaviors. Their personality structure has formed in such a way that this is the only way they know how to exist within relationships. In personality psychology, this is often described as a self-reinforcing personality pattern. Once a behavioral strategy successfully protects someone or gives them influence, the brain stores that pattern as a reliable survival method. For example, imagine a communication style that produces 3 consistent outcomes. First, conflicts appear without the person ever needing to confront anyone directly. Second, influence is exercised without the person ever taking responsibility. Third, even when relationships collapse, they suffer minimal personal consequences. If a person experiences this pattern repeatedly throughout life, something powerful happens. The brain interprets the strategy as effective, and once a strategy is perceived as effective, the motivation to change becomes extremely weak, because from their perspective, the system works. This is why observers often feel confused. From the outside, the behavior looks dysfunctional, but from the inside, it has functioned as a successful survival mechanism for years, sometimes decades. Ancient philosophical traditions describe this phenomenon differently. In the language of Buddhist philosophy, particularly in the text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this would be described as the momentum of karma. But karma in this context does not mean punishment. It means something much more psychological. Karma simply refers to the direction of consciousness repeated over time. The more often a certain direction is repeated, the more invisible alternative directions become. Eventually, the person is no longer consciously choosing the pattern. The pattern is choosing for them. And this leads to one of the most dangerous misunderstandings people make when dealing with these personalities. Many well-meaning people say something like this: maybe they act that way because they were hurt. Their childhood must have been difficult. There is truth in those statements. Painful experiences often shape destructive relational strategies. However, there is an important distinction that must be made here. Compassion and permissiveness are not the same thing. Compassion means recognizing someone's pain while refusing to allow that pain to harm others. Permissiveness, on the other hand, means excusing every behavior because the person once suffered. The difference between those two responses is enormous. Interestingly, the Tibetan Book of the Dead expresses this principle with remarkable clarity. True compassion does not permit confusion to continue indefinitely. If someone is given unlimited understanding without boundaries, they rarely interpret it as kindness. More often, they interpret it as permission. And once behavior is perceived as permitted, it tends to intensify rather than diminish. For this reason, the most responsible response to this personality type is not deeper psychological analysis. It is clear relational distance inside clear boundaries. In spiritual philosophy, there is even a term for this. It might be translated as compassionate disengagement. Many people misunderstand compassion as always staying close to someone. But sometimes compassion takes a very different form. It means no longer intervening, no longer reacting, no longer participating in the ambiguous emotional space the other person continuously creates, because there is another risk people rarely consider. When we remain deeply entangled in a distorted relational dynamic, we do not merely reinforce the other person's behavioral pattern. We begin strengthening our own patterns as well. Each time we respond to their indirect messages. Each time we attempt to clarify the misunderstandings they created. Each time we step in to mediate conflicts they designed. We unknowingly become participants in the structure. At that moment, we are no longer observers. We become co-creators of the pattern. Ancient texts describe this phenomenon with a striking warning. If we remain inside someone else's confusion for too long, our own perception gradually becomes confused as well. But there is also good news hidden inside these experiences. Encountering this type of person is not always meaningless suffering. Sometimes it represents a turning point in relational awareness. Through these experiences, we begin learning several difficult truths. Not every statement deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding can be resolved through explanation. And kindness does not require the absence of boundaries. In fact, psychological maturity is often misunderstood. Many people believe maturity means enduring more, tolerating more, sacrificing more. But genuine maturity looks very different. A mature person is not someone who endures endlessly. A mature person is someone who knows exactly when to step back, From the perspective of contemplative philosophy, this realization resembles a form of liberation practice. Not liberation from the world, but liberation from unnecessary entanglement. Yet another question inevitably appears at this stage of the discussion. What should we actually do when we encounter this personality? Type in places where relationships cannot easily be severed. In family, in workplaces, in religious communities, in social organizations. These environments share one difficult characteristic. Often the person who raises the problem becomes more uncomfortable than the person who caused it. And the individuals who operate through indirect distortion understand this structure extremely well, which means that dealing with them requires more than emotional awareness. It requires strategic clarity. In the next part of this discussion, we will explore exactly that. Practical response strategies for real-world situations. Families, workplaces, and social communities, where walking away is not always possible. But before we move forward, remember one final thought. Recognizing a destructive pattern in a relationship does not mean you are becoming cynical. It may simply mean that your awareness has grown sharper. And sometimes awareness is the first quiet step toward freedom. If this reflection resonates with experiences in your own life, I invite you to continue this series, because in the next part, we will explore a deeper question many people struggle with after leaving such relationships. Why does the mind continue to return to the relationship even after we have stepped away? And what do psychology and ancient philosophy say about finally letting go? If this conversation has been meaningful to you, consider subscribing and sharing the lecture. This channel exists for people who are trying to protect their clarity in a world where confusion often speaks the loudest. I'll see you in the next talk.